power makes us dumber.
Power makes us dumber.
Absolutely. Our empathy goes down. Tech IPOs are one of the most efficient levers of wealth transformation that exist in modern society. And frankly, my goal at Culture Amp is to pack as many Black and brown people into that rocket ship as possible. It also isn't rocket surgery. Change is accessible if you're willing to lean into it.
Change is always accessible.
I'm Aubrey Blanche, and to me, to belong means to connect with someone else or a group of someone else's over a set of shared experiences or experiences that we can find some level of commonality in.
It is so good to see you. It has been so long.
I know. We had a whole year.
Talk a little bit about your role at Culture Amp and how you show up and how you reconcile who you are internally versus who you are externally.
So I came in as the director of DEI, kind of yelling from the rooftops, you have this incredible business supporting other companies on your DEI journey. There's no business strategy around this. And I sort of developed the business strategy, and the company said, this is pretty good. Let's use it. And so my job is to look after people operations, DEI, sustainability, philanthropy, and then also sort of strategically guide Culture Amp in delivering, software solutions for companies that are looking to improve DEI in their own companies.
Shireen Daniels, who's the author of The Anti-Racist Organization, defines anti-racism as a redistribution of power. What is your definition of anti-racism, and what is your approach from a broader view?
So I think there's that. I think Dr. Kendi's definition is really useful and very much influences me, which is this idea of something is racist or anti-racist as defined by the impact it has on racialized people. I think with a specific focus on Black and Indigenous people in particular. And so for me, it's really about how do we intentionally make choices with the experience of racialized people in mind? So an example of where this has come up is as we've set up the Culture Amp Foundation and really thought about employee activation and also our commercial grants and discounts programs, we've said, we have a particular focus on supporting the Black and Indigenous community. So there's, we offer a 35% discount on our software to just nonprofits. But if that nonprofit primarily benefits Black or Indigenous people, the software is free.
Wow.
And that is because we recognize that the majority, I think it's more than 90% of philanthropic dollars go to white-run nonprofits.
Wow.
Or even for commercial businesses that are at least 51% owned by Black and Indigenous people, they receive a 38% discount off our software. And that 38% is specifically the pay gap. 38 cents is the pay gap between white men and Black women. And so we believe if Black people are being paid less in the economy in general, they can pay less for our services. So it's not everything, but it is a way that we try to realize those anti-racism commitments in the way that we run the business.
I'm just breathing into that. That's just so powerful. One of the things that I know of you is the intersectionalities of who you are and how you are so open in speaking about those intersectionalities and so seamless in navigating your own intersectionalities, which are really beautiful.
I'm so glad it looks seamless on the outside. It is not on the inside.
Tell us the story of when you realized that you were white and then when you realized you actually weren't.
So my biological mother is Mexican American. My Mexican side is mixed, white and Indigenous. And I was adopted by my adoptive mom is second generation Irish and Belgian American, and my adoptive dad is a quarter blood Choctaw. So he's an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation, and has always done a lot of Indian law work in addition to his sort of like corporate law stuff. But what's really important is all of us are white assumed. So I grew up in like the perfect experiment of not understanding how much of race is about phenotype.
Tell us what phenotype is.
Oh, so phenotype is like how you look. Yeah. So components of racism are like colorism, right? How light or dark you are. Featureism. So how much do your features look indigenous or Afro? And then texturism. So like what is the texture of your hair? And obviously mine is very straight and this is natural. And so for me, my family constantly talked about our heritage. And in my home, there was no hierarchy of it. It was just like, oh, dad is Choctaw, mom is Irish, Aub is Mexican. And like, isn't that special that our family is this way? And it was second grade when I learned that Mexican was lower on the hierarchy because it was Heritage Day at school and we all had to color flags. And the teachers, I think with all good intent, like grouped all the flags together. And me and my classmate adopted from Korea were like put in the corner. And also asking a second grader to draw the Mexican flag is just mean, right? Like there's so many animals. And from then on, all of my classmates knew I was Mexican. And I started getting these comments, like one that sticks in my mind. There was a guy who bullied me in high school who would like slam my locker and be like, hey, Mexican. But also this one girl, we were in religion class and it was a group project and our desks were pushed together. And she said, well, will you sharpen the pencils? And I said, well, why me? She said, Mexicans do service jobs. And
wow,
I remember like being very proud for my parents that I was Latina. It was incredibly important to me and not feeling like I had any role models like Jennifer Lopez. And like when I found out that Madonna in Evita and Catherine Zeta-Jones in The Mask of Zorro were not actually Latina, I cried for 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Because that was the only like models that I had for who I was allowed to be. And I didn't want to be any of those things. And so I grew up with this really, really strong sense of like knowing that my identity made me less than in some social way, but also knowing that that wasn't required because my family had taught me that I was equal in that way. And then when I got to college, right, because I went to this tiny high school in a tiny town where everybody knew I was Mexican and made sure I didn't forget it. I got to college and nobody cared or knew. Right. And suddenly I realized that all of the racism that I experienced was optional for me. Wow. And that required a whole reworking of my understanding of where I stood in the hierarchy. And what has been a journey of probably a decade that I now actually have, to use your word, equanimity, to hold the duality of is I can both exist in a state of racialization and possess less privilege in this system and also possess an immense amount of privilege because of my phenotype and because of my whiteness as well.
I love that. Bridge builder, translator, advocate for transferring of power. You are a trans ally.
I try. I try very hard.
Talk about being a trans ally.
I would say that in previous versions of my life, I totally, not that you can like call yourself an ally, right? It's like a label that's put on you. It's not something you can claim. But I would say that I intended to show up as an ally to the trans community. I have a wealth. I am blessed with a lot of trans friends and people in my circle. And I have been with them at various points in their transitions, for example. But it has been, over the last couple of years, an entirely different experience. My now spouse, yay, we just got married this week. My spouse is trans, and I would say the amount of like learning I've had about what it really means to show up for a trans person, whether they're in transition or not, I think has developed in terms of its depth in a way that I look back and I see with maybe a little bit of fondness how ignorant I was of all of the things that went into that experience. And not that I'm an expert on the trans experience as a very cis woman, but the level of knowledge I now have is exponentially larger. And I think that that positions me in many ways, while I'm still imperfect, to be a better ally than I was before, whether that's to my spouse or it's just to anyone else who has that identity.
I want to go back to when you say race is a process, to share with us what that means to you, and to tie it back to how you show up as an ally in the trans community.
I think identity is a process. Like it is formed over time and it shifts and it changes. Like it's a fluid thing. So it certainly started with, first simply becoming aware that trans people exist. And I know that sounds silly, but like when you grow up in a teeny tiny town and go to 16 years of Catholic school, like if you don't have exposure to those ideas, it's first, so this life experience is one that people have. And I first encountered trans people in college. And, my first thought was like, well, you just seem like a person. You seem nice. Let's be friends. And then, the awareness of the different and often exponentially more difficult set of life experiences that comes with that identity comes to your consciousness. But I think as I've grown and as my context and my power has grown in the world, I believe that what I should do and can do have shifted, so that involves certainly continuing to be loving and supportive of the specific trans people in my life, but also it, now entails using my platform to speak up and speak to the cisgender community about transphobia and what they should be doing. It means, in my job, prioritizing, we are in the middle of building our trans inclusion strategy and elevating the voices of trans people, but also listening to them and resolving the challenges that they say that they face. But I think also in my economic position, it also means contributing financially in whatever way I have access to financial resources to support the trans community.
Hence the redistribution of power.
Yeah. And I think, I would love to be like, oh, I've donated $10 million. I haven't. I don't have that
yet.
But I think about if each of us tried to redirect $5, right? And sometimes $5 isn't accessible to some people, and that's not worthy of judgment. But like, if we think about, let's say the average is $5, the way that would fundamentally change the world. And I think that's also a really important thing to think about in my sort of praxis of equity and justice, is that like each of us can do one small thing. And if we each start pulling at that one of those threads in like the carpet that is oppression, the carpet's going to unravel pretty quickly.
You said it's the first time that I'm being taken seriously at my job.
Yeah.
I want to connect that statement to the fact that you have arrived at an internal state of incredible inner peace. How you have arrived at that state of inner peace has afforded you this opportunity to be taken seriously, because you are able to self-regulate, self-connect, be in a place of authenticity. I'm curious about how those two pieces have helped shift, and I'm going to use your own words, race consciousness over time, inspired and influenced you to lead your teams differently as you've grown and scaled them.
So yeah, it's like this chicken and egg kind of thing. But I think if I pulled it apart, I would say that like the reason I've been put in this position at Culture Amp, where I'm not only taken seriously, but like really listened to, is because that was the terms on which I started the relationship with the CEO. So I had I spent 2.5 years interviewing for jobs before I landed the one that I have. So I got like a bajillion rejections. And I made a very conscious decision going into my interview with Didier, the CEO, who ended up being my boss for 2 years. But, my goal was to give him the clearest picture of the leader he'd be hiring if he said yes to me. And in many ways, I intended to be polarizing, because I believe that I am polarizing. I don't see that as a negative, because I am trying to create change, and change is uncomfortable, and it requires a level of directness to people in power that comes at a risk to myself. And so I came in with I had already done the reflection to be like, what do I need? What are my terms to accept this job? And I walked in being like, you definitely want to hire me, but here's the terms that come with it. I want my job title. I want my right to run a consulting company on the side. And, even he said, he was like, that's fine. You can run your separate company. I don't care. But why do you care so much about it? And I said, because I need to create my own economic stability so I can quit on principle if you do something I can't live with.
What was his response? That's amazing.
And he was like, okay.
Wow.
And I think it says something that he's not worried about doing that. If he's like, fine, build your security, but I'm never going to put you in the position where that's a choice you have to make. But I said, because I am lower on the ladder than people who I need to push against and change, I need to amass my own power to allow me to actually complete the responsibilities that you've given me in this role. So this is a way for me to fulfill the promise I make to you by accepting the job offer. So I'm not just doing it for selfish reasons. It is also like a very deep ethical commitment for me to actually do what this role says it's supposed to do. And the reason I think that has set me up for everything else is because Didier knew exactly the person he was getting, and he was opting in to being held accountable and to be challenged, to uphold his own values and his own aspirations for the company that he founded with some other folks. And now, I did that with a lot of CEOs who were like, absolutely not, get the hell away from me. I will not hire you, right? I think Culture Amp was the only job offer I got out of probably nearly 100 interviews that I went through. And so
that's conviction and commitment to your values. Wow.
I think with my privilege, I wanted to put myself in a position where I could do something that I found meaningful, which might be selfish, but it is. And so there's like that. The reason that I think is because I believe that I said, this is what I want. And so people intentionally opted in to go on the journey with me, even if they didn't fully know. I believe that was the best way that I could operate with informed consent, basically. And it also minimized that I get fired in a year for being too mouthy. But I think that idea of informed consent also really animates the way that I lead my teams, which is, and I've also become more direct with my team about racial issues and giving them space to talk about them. So my team is, as you can imagine, very much a mix. I've got, a team member who is South Asian and a refugee and a woman. I've got a team member who is Black, Jewish, and queer. I have, a team member who's a caregiver of people with disabilities. And so I think it's really important that I give them as much context as possible so they can make the most personally aligned choices. So whether that means, there was an example where an employee did something that was pretty racist, and it was kind of not exactly directed at, but not irrelevant to one of my team members, who is a person of color. And, I said to her, technically, this is your job to give the person the feedback and correct their behavior. But as a white assumed woman, it is less emotional labor for me to do it. And you are allowed to tell me that you do not want to do that and set that boundary to protect yourself. There will be no cost to you professionally for doing that. But I think, and the employee actually said, I really don't want to have that conversation. It sounds exhausting. And I said, great. I will go have that conversation. I put that in her performance review as something that I saw that she did that I considered a positive. And that's because certainly I want people on my team who can get shit done, but a part of my job as their leader is to help them have a level of conviction and care for themselves that I believe will sustain them to do work over time. And so for me, knowing this particular employee who often would say yes to things and wouldn't mind their own boundaries, to me, I am like, not only am I glad that you protected yourself out of my personal duty of care for you, but you are now a more effective practitioner of our craft of equity by being able to preserve yourself. And it is important that I put this in your performance review because I am your boss at the end of the day. And you need to be professionally as well as personally rewarded for that. And so I've done that with especially my racialized colleagues or those from marginalized backgrounds. But I think that's like where it comes in is I try to be conscious. Or another example, I had someone who joined, I will just say, part of my broader team and like totally underbid themselves on their salary. And I wrote back and I said, I'm sorry, my minimum budget for this role is this. And so I'm hoping you're willing to accept that. And they were like, what? And I was like, well, I'm not going to pay you what you asked for because when I look across my team at your level, it would be wrong for me to pay you that. So I'm going to pay you what I would pay you at the level based on your skills. And like, it cost company a bit of money, but we had already budgeted for it. And I'm totally confident that that person is going to perform better because they know that they're valued and they're going to be treated fairly.
Of course.
And then it just feels good to me. Like that's who I want to be. And so it's more about like, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't make that choice.
It's the value of integrity.
Yeah.
The value of integrity. You're rewarding emotional intelligence.
I try.
You're prioritizing a balance of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, that emotional intelligence and the getting shit done aspects of who they are, right? You talked about amassing my own power. I love that. And then you gave a ton of examples about how you yourself as a leader show up and empower your team, which I also just adore about you. Talk about this concept of power. Talk about designing equitable organizations, designing equitable teams, and power.
When I think about power, the first thing that comes up, it's like, so I really believe that all of our work has to first start internally. Like we have to transform who we are in order to transform the work that we put out into the world. I don't think there's any way around that. And so the first thing that like comes to me always is that power makes us dumber. And
power makes us dumber.
Absolutely.
So there's science behind that, actually. There's science behind this.
There's an article from The Atlantic that I assign in all of my like anti-racist, like equitable leadership courses, where it actually talks about like the neuroplasticity of power accumulation and the way that it actually inhibits our ability, like our empathy goes down, our ability to read rooms goes down. And so I personally think about that probably more than is like healthy. And the reason is because as I become more senior in a role or I become more economically stable or whatever, I'm highly conscious of the way that I lose my ability to actually connect with people on whose behalf I want to work or who in service of whom I want to work. And so I try really hard to continuously put myself in situations of discomfort or put myself in situations where as much as possible, I am like at the bottom of the hierarchy or on the outside, because I believe that one, that is a good emotional experience for me, but I actually believe it's partially like a treatment for my brain to at least help mitigate or minimize the potentially damaging effects of being in a position of higher authority or power. And so for me, that has to be a part of my praxis if I actually want to achieve the things that are aligned to my integrity. So that's like number one, that has to be a part of me doing my job correctly. But also I find even often misunderstood by the people that I'm looking to support. And so I have to be a really good storyteller, because for me, the first thing I did when I came into Culture Amp was audit the performance, promotion, and pay processes for equity from a demographic perspective. I basically let the ERG program languish. And that was because I had limited time and I had to pick. And my particular theory of change says, like, employees can begin to create community on their own. They don't need me to, I can provide structure later, but they don't need me to continue meeting and building connection. They cannot make sure that they are being promoted to positions of power without the specific work that I do behind the scenes. And I will never pick connection over power. And in the systems we operate in capitalistic systems, power is status and money. And so it's not that I think connection is unimportant or a sense of belonging is unimportant. I don't think that's right. I don't think in binaries like that. But I have to, in order to actually achieve those goals, increase the amount of power that is flowing to those communities. So, people talk about, like, why do I hang out at Culture Amp? Why do I hang out in, like, high growth tech, which is like the center of the Death Star in terms of like capitalism, which is based on white supremacy. My answer of why I do this work in that context is that I believe that tech IPOs are one of the most efficient, like, levers of wealth transformation that exist in modern society. And frankly, my goal at Culture Amp is to pack as many Black and brown people into that rocket ship before it takes off as possible. And so it is more important that I am deeply involved in talent succession management and making sure that BIPOC folks are equitably represented in our leadership accelerators, or that our ERG leaders are being promoted into management at higher rates than their peers. And now that I have more resources, our ERG program is thriving, and there are more things like that. So it's not for me always like a one thing doesn't matter and one does. It's there is an order of operations, and I will pick the things that are more directly tied to wealth and power transfer first. And that's true at Culture Amp, but it's also true with all my consulting clients. So if you come to me for a DEI strategy, which a lot of companies do, what I write for you is not only custom to your organization based on like all of the data that I collect, it's very focused on what I call like back end or back office stuff that often isn't thought of as traditional DEI work, but I believe should actually be the core of what all of us practitioners
What are some examples of that?
So things like developing peer mentorship programs, prioritizing sponsorship over mentorship, like, I think the most important thing any company can do when it comes to DEI is audit their performance process for equity. And why the performance process is so important is because it is so deterministic of every set of opportunities that someone is given, right? Like, lots of companies are like, oh, we audit our pay. I'm like, yeah, but if your performance system is fucked, your pay audit's going to hide a lot of unfairness.
Beautiful.
And so for me, auditing, you should audit everything, but being highly skeptical of your performance process is the first step towards ensuring that people are receiving procedural justice in the workplace, and ultimately can unlock, understanding where you have equity or cultural gaps, but also helps you, put in the right, I'm a little bit of an experimentalist scientist, so like the right treatment. So is it, we're seeing lower performance scores in this part of the business for this demographic. Well, let's go figure out why. Is it they're not achieving their targets? Let's go figure out why, because the underlying assumption is they do not possess less capability. Yeah. And so anyway, like, that's how I think about it, is there's this like internal, constantly having to grapple with your own power and trying to remain humble that the more power you have, the more capability you have to create harm. And then focusing on power redistribution within organizations before anything else in this work.
I love it so much. Where would you like to see organizations in 10 years?
I think I would like to see organizations that reflect the world that they live in. And I don't just mean that in the sense that like your careers page no longer has more dogs than Black people on it. I mean that you have actually made intentional efforts in all of the right and deep structural ways to put people in roles where they are given decision-making power over how that organization operates and transforms. And that as much as possible, that's done across, as many dimensions of identity, especially marginalized identity, as possible, while being conscious of those intersections. So I know that's kind of a big ticket to write, but again, I don't think it's impossible. At Culture Amp, I've seen, well, we're certainly not there, and we definitely have gaps, especially calling out, certain groups in leadership. We've also addressed enormous gaps in representation and positions of influence and power in that organization in just a couple of years. And while it's certainly been, intentional and some pretty good bets on what to do, it also isn't rocket surgery. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's important, is that change is accessible if you're willing to lean into it.
Change is always accessible whenever anyone is willing to lean into it, period. This conversation has been just magical. Aubrey, thank you so much for coming today, for sharing your brilliance, your wisdom, your insight, your perspicacity. It's always such a pleasure. I'm so happy to look at your face.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.